Thank you to Freya for the introduction, and Cosmin and Chinyi and the team at Parasite for inviting me to speak here. I just want to say that it's pretty unbelievable to be standing in the Sunbeam Theater. Like, I've been hearing about this space from my grandmother since I was a child, so it's pretty magical. Like, I'm up here with the greats. As Freya mentioned, I work at AA, and I co-run an art space with Lee Kit in Sham Shui Po. I encourage you to come to both. They're both in Hong Kong and not very far from here, because Hong Kong is very small. And then, funnily, right next to Things That Can Happen is another art space called 100 Feet Park, and inside there's a show organized by Gam Cheng, who's actually Clara's partner, called Curate No More. So I think maybe we want to go check that out and see what they're proposing. Okay, so Things That Can Happen. I know I'm not meant to talk really about my space, but just very briefly, it relates to why I want to talk about what we're talking about, is really trying to find a not-for-profit type of space that can really put the artist at the center of all of our projects. So we kind of have this space. It's a venue for conversation, for art production, for residencies, and the idea is to just allow anything to happen that takes the artist as a starting point with whatever kind of crazy ideas they want to develop. And having said this, then, what I want to talk about today is the solo exhibition and what the solo exhibition can do. In Asia, I feel a lot of the exhibitions that get picked up and discussed are often major, thematic, curated group shows. And this could be for a number of reasons. Maybe one is because it's still a developing public, and discursive titles that are big and sexy are easier to connect with and relate to. And that's a little bit less nuanced than a title or a topic or a work that an artist might develop. Secondly, maybe it's because of the institutions that we have. There is very little infrastructure that can maybe support the sort of a larger solo exhibition, which takes maybe a catalog raisonné, it takes a lot of research. Possibly there are very few institutions that actually have large enough collections on one artist that can actually collate these together to create some sort of art historical statement around one artist, right? So I'm not exactly sure, but I think that from my observation, a lot of the exhibitions that get circulated and discussed and remembered and historicized are in fact group exhibitions. And this is something that we kind of touched on at the Asia Art Archive conference on exhibitions last year. Different type of exhibition conference. But okay, so I'm going to take a look at 2 to 3 case studies of solo exhibitions that, for me, do a lot more and are very generous and collaborative in spirit, and together produce different forms of knowledge and discourse. I say 2 to 3 because it depends on time. So let's see. So an active discursive process turning the exhibition into an invitation as opposed to a conclusion, and an open laboratory to collaborate and co-create knowledge, right? So the first one is at Béton Salon. I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with this space in Paris, and it's, Béton Salon is a center for art and research, and it's located inside of a university, and I think that's pretty important. They moved into this university in 2007. They were initially in the Marais, like an independent space. They were set up as an artist-run project, and initially it was also similarly to Things That Can Happen. It was to provide a grassroots platform for sort of projects to develop with a lot of their friends or artists they believed in that didn't necessarily find kind of a voice in larger institutional frameworks. They moved into this space in the aim of trying to intervene into the curriculum of the university. And that also expands beyond that. I think in general, they try to intervene into institutional methodologies of practice and knowledge systems in France and in Paris. But this is a really good laboratory for them to experiment with that. So I think from their website, it says that they aim to create interactions between artistic and academic research by creating the conditions for encounters between people who work in different fields and contexts. And the aim is to shift boundaries between disciplinary categories or networks that can only encourage the production and sharing of knowledge. And what I personally find exciting about this is that often artists or people working within the art field are very curious and necessarily go out to explore different fields of knowledge and respond to life and draw in from different experiences and disciplines. But often art itself is very siloed, and a lot of different disciplines feel that art is in fact irrelevant to whatever they're actually practicing. So I feel that Béton Salon is really trying to break down these stereotypes and these boundaries and allow whatever methodologies or ideas that artists are exploring to live beyond the realm of the gallery space. So having said this, I just want to mention that they're independent from the university and they receive independent funding, which I think is also important, that they're not actually part of this structure in this institution. So it gives them a lot more freedom to do and experiment with the different organizations. So the exhibition I'm going to be talking about is The Day After by Mariam Ghani. The Day After draws from a much larger project, a work in progress, called Independence Day, 1934 to 1975. And as a research project, it started in 2009. It's a collection of photographs collected from 29 different archives in Asia and Africa, picturing events which occurred on the day of independence from former colonized countries. The project looks specifically at that moment of transformation, that 24-hour period during which a set of rituals, ceremonies, speeches herald the transformation of a territory into a nation state. In the artist's words, the photos highlight, quote, how post-colonial states in Asia and Africa preserve the founding images of their inception as independent nations. So I'm just going to show you a few images of the archival images. So these are kind of the starting points of this project and the display. And this is the installation images, installation views, just to give you kind of a brief idea. So starting with the collection of photographs, the exhibition was conceived of as a collaborative process. So the invitation from Melanie, who's the director of Béton Salon, and Virginie, who's the associate curator, was to try to integrate a lot of the workshops, discourses, conversations that happen, and the research that happens behind the scenes of the project, to integrate that into the exhibition itself. How can you give manifestation and physical existence to the conversations and research that happen behind, right? So the entire project involves different circles of individuals. So like I said, the first was Mariam Ghani, Mélanie Bouteloup, the director, and Virginie, who's the associate curator. And together they kind of framed the entire project. How it's going to, who are going to be involved with the conversations, how it's going to take physical form, et cetera, et cetera. And then a lot of the images were selected out of the 29 archives, and they selected these images together to co-create this exhibition. So intentionally, they also dropped the roles of curator and artist to be able to co-conceive of this space. The second layer of involvement and collaboration was the people involved in the architecture and the structure of the space, so that they did not preconceive of the way that they wanted the exhibition to be formed, but they allowed Adrien Géranton, who's an architect, to be able to inform how the space could actually encompass and contain these various modules and conversations that were happening. So just to show you again. And the most important set of conversations that were happening were actually with the various researchers, the archivists, the historians, the students, and all of these various levels of individuals who they wanted to involve into the intervention of this project. So they actually involved a lot of the people who supported Mariam during her research process into the way that the entire form would take, but also through a lot of workshops and seminars, they actually contributed to what was actually exhibited within this space. So a lot of the materials were added throughout the entire process and photographs. So for instance, a Moroccan student in political science and sociology, that participated in the 2011 uprising in Morocco, he brought materials from the uprising and paired them with images in Mariam's installation. He compared the images he brought with the images from the official archives, and he analyzed the way the movements have evolved and the changing stakes of the people involved. The activists, the government, civilians, throughout time, so from the images that she started with in the 1930s until today, and how these contradictory depictions and experiences of historic events are lived through now and how they're remembered. So these interjections were recorded, and the materials he contributed were added to the exhibition. I don't know if I have, so here you have a screen, and these are like a set of documentations of a lot of these conversations that were happening. So that was kind of, yeah. So that's kind of the first example of the project. I'm going to skip to Asia Art Archives project. I know I'm cheating a little, but I will stay on it for a very short period of time. So the second project I'm going to talk about is Excessive Enthusiasm, the Habik Chun Archive. So this is the Asia Art Archive. It's a very different type of space, and I think the different type of spaces and sites is also important, and their intentions of these organizations. Béton Salon being trying to, I think, really activate in one single artist projects and trying to do as much with it as possible, and to, cultivate conversations that can live on beyond the site of the exhibition. AA is a research center and a resource for contemporary art and a recent development in art in Asia. And this is the physical space, and then we have a huge collection online. So this is some of Habik Chun's artwork. He's an artist who was active from the 1960s through 2008 when he passed away. He was a self-taught artist. He was a sculptor primarily and a printmaker. I won't give too much emphasis on Ha's work itself because I won't give justice to him as an artist, considering I have 5 minutes. But I think it's more about the methodology that we're trying to explore and experiment with. And Asia Art Archive doesn't normally do many exhibitions, so it's still a practice that we're trying to understand what actually makes sense as an archive to generate more knowledge, right? So this is Ha's work. This is the archive that we faced in about 2 or 3 years ago. I think Michelle is our researcher. She visited this archive with the Ha family 2 to 3 years ago. It's floor to ceiling. Very few people have gone inside. Even his family kind of left him in his own personal space, and it was like his haven where he escaped to. Some of the works, just to give you, he was known as the person who would go to almost every single exhibition from the 1960s to 2000 through to the 2000s and document almost every exhibition that ever happened in Hong Kong, right? So he was not only doesn't only find notebooks of his own works and documentation of his own works, but he was really known as the person who documented every single exhibition. So there are about 1,500 records of exhibitions in his collection, right? Sorry. So these are some of the examples. Okay. So the exhibition itself, sorry. This is the exhibition. We see the exhibition not so much as like a conclusive display of his materials, but really as an invitation for people to come and take a look into what actually exists in the collection. The archive itself, as we saw, was just floor to ceiling and nearly impossible for people to access. Even for us who are working at Asia Art Archive, a number of us cannot actually enter into the space because it's very fragile. The roofs are crumbling in. And so this acts as just slices into the collection that allow individuals who are visiting, curators, researchers to come in and explore what actually it contains. And throughout the process, even for us at the archive, it made the person real for us. Like before that, we would just hear about this important archivist and artist who is very prolific, but at this moment, he turns real and he becomes tangible, and all the facets of him as a person are present in the space with us, and really manage to draw you into wanting to explore him as the many facets of him as a person, So now we are inviting a number of collaborators from the Hong Kong University of Art to come and develop a curriculum around recent Hong Kong art history with us, taking this as a starting point with these 1,500 exhibitions. We're working with Walid Rad, who's actually exploring these notebooks that Habik Chun obsessively kind of collage page by page. And Walid's going to find a way of sort of drawing out some of the shapes and forms and liberate them. And then another critic curator, Jasper Lau in Hong Kong, is writing a 15,000-word essay that's kind of autobiographical about his experience trying to tell a history of Hong Kong, a Hong Kong art history, and having these gaps that need to be filled. So that's kind of the second example, and I'm going to go back to the third. Sorry. This is also an exhibition that happened in Hong Kong in 2008. It was curated by Valerie Dorans. It took place at the Hong Kong Museum of Art, which is a very specific type of institution. It's known as pretty conventional. Large part of its collection is ink, and I think that in 2008 it realized that it had a lot of blind spots, and so it invited 4 curators in to shed light on its blind spots and maybe draw from its collection to do some interesting things. Sorry, my papers are a little lost. Okay. Valerie Dorans, usually her exhibitions are a way of highlighting artists in Hong Kong that have been largely forgotten or are very difficult to pin down and to create exhibitions around. So this was a perfect example of it. Antonio Mack passed away in 1994 at the age of 43. He's largely remembered as a very enigmatic figure in Hong Kong. He was very intense. Like, we hear stories of him just standing outside of university in Goldsmith, and he would be smoking, and people would just be like so drawn to this person. But very few of his artworks were actually seen. A lot of them were just dispersed after he passed away. This is again because of the lack of institutions here, maybe a lack of interest in Hong Kong art, and so on. And so Valerie was on a mission to try to revive this person in the public imagination of Hong Kong people. So these are some of his works. The motifs that keep reappearing are like tigers and horses and the human body, but not the human body so much as physiologically or biologically, but as almost a vessel for a spirit or for spirituality or soul. So his works. And so this exhibition took a layered approach to consider how the artist is remembered, physically, psychologically, and metaphorically. And by the same token, calls him back to the present physically, psychologically, and metaphorically through the exhibition. She dedicated a major exhibition at the City Museum by conjuring him through the work of other artists and reinserting him into the public imagination and subtly back into institutional art history. Okay. So the first layer is an exhibition of Mack's works with over 120 works, and some of these are in the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and some of them were from the Hong Kong Heritage Museum, but large part of them were in the hands of like bars or restaurants and different types of collectors in Hong Kong and overseas. So it's a pretty grueling process to try to piece these together. The second layer, which is the more interesting part here, is that she invited various generations of artists from Hong Kong primarily to try to reinterpret his work. And so, just to run through 2 of them, Feng Ming Chip is a calligraphic artist. He selected passages from the writings of Antonio and transferred them onto wall passages in a darkened room. So visitors were plunged into darkness and a cave-like space holding a small torch to scroll over the text, as though entering the private thoughts of Antonio Mack. This is personally my favorite piece in the show. This is my favorite piece, but it's drawn from this. So this is Antonio Mack's documentation of his works. So animals with railings in between. And so this is Guan Zhenji's work, where he collected all of the Hong Kong Museum of Art's iron gates to put in the middle of the exhibition hall, so it would completely obstruct you from entering into the space. And in Chinese, these are called iron horses. So it references Antonio Mac's obsession with horses and the sort of very surreal ladders, and that these types of motifs that would keep reoccurring in his works. But also it would reflect on his political activism when he was still alive. And also sort of like a subtle not so subtle institutional critique of the Hong Kong Museum of Art and navigating people and such. So basically she invited 8 artists to conjure him through their own work. And this is one of them. And then the third layer is a documentary presentation. Both private and institutional collectors of his works were invited to photograph his art in situ, in one instance in their exact position, whether in display at home or in an office. So I don't have images of that, but they would just be documentary images of people taking photographs of their Antonio Mac, whether it's in a crate or it's under their desk or it's like actually on a bar, to show where he actually exists physically in our world. But what I find really sort of inspiring about this project is that while Valerie's trying to insert him back into an art history where he's subtly and fleetingly being forgotten, she also doesn't use text or words to reinscribe him into her art history. She uses interpretations, through the works of others to reignite him in our imagination. So she avoids pinning his art down to a set of terms and definitions, but his works remain enigmatic and intangible, very much like him as a person. So I think I'll leave more formal conclusions to the discussion, but I just wanted to make a proposition that maybe curated exhibitions don't always need to, or not always obviously, I think many of you actually do solo exhibitions, but in this region, I think they've lost their capacity to create discourse and enliven our imagination and actually contribute to knowledge beyond the four walls of the gallery. And these are just certain propositions. Thank you.